Welcome back to Nights with Chris Boyle. Joining us now back on the show is John Koufos. John, thank you so much for coming back on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Good to be with you.
So for folks at home who don't remember your first appearance, you're a law expert and a criminal justice reform expert who actually spent some time on the inside himself, saw how bad these conditions are and how much people need assistance with reentry when they're the kind of people who actually want to reintegrate into our society. Talk to us a little bit about the work that you do.
Yeah, it's that last part that matters most, right? Folks who want to reintegrate. I mean, I've always looked at reentry as a public safety tool, right? And as I mentioned on your show last time to your viewers, when I was locked up, nobody asked me for money. Chris, nearly everyone asked me for a job. And I think that that's what we want. We know right now that 95% of everybody sitting in a prison or jail cell right now is coming out one day to all of our communities. And how we want those people coming out is up to us. So this isn't like a hug a thug program or a social services kind of thing or soft on crime. This is actually something that President Trump championed in his first term through the First Step Act and many second chance hiring initiatives.
Well, and it's interesting because those are the programs that tend to show the most success. I mean, it's kind of common sense, right? If you have a job, then you're connected with your community. You probably don't need the resources, so you're not going to steal if you need them. Obviously, plenty of criminals don't steal out of need. They do it because they're sociopaths or maladjusted, whatever. But if the need's not there, if you have reason to be involved in your community, you're getting more of a moral foundation. Often these are programs when they're working with people who are acting sort of as mentors. I know here in Los Angeles, there's programs like that. I think Father John Boyle's guy who does like Homey Industries out here.
So Homeboy Industries, yes.
So yeah, you're familiar with them. So yeah, programs like that have shown a significant amount of success working with people who are out of prison, lowering the recidivism rate for people who actually have the ability to reintegrate in society. Talk to me about some of the success that you guys have been seeing. I mean, I know that you're really excited for some of the programs that might be happening with the Trump administration, but talk to me about some of the programs that you've seen give us the most success.
Sure. So I think that things that really hard skill to jobs are really important when paired with, what they call soft skills, right? A lot of these folks have never held a job before. So for example, down in Florida, Governor DeSantis, Ricky Dixon do a really nice job. They have coding programs down there. They have welding programs. They have programs, culinary programs. You'd think you're on America's Top Chef, right? The way that the prisons compete against each other, same in a masonry program. Up in New Jersey, my home state, I had the pleasure of helping build and lead something called the New Jersey Reentry Corporation, where we help thousands of folks get into jobs appropriate for them. You're seeing advanced manufacturing behind the wall in places like Kansas. And there's a fantastic program called The Last Mile, which The Last Mile is a coding and tech upskilling program around the country. They're in Indiana, California, and a number of other places. So these things are popping up all over the place. There's programs that sort of have dual social and work purpose, like down in Florida, again, there's programs to train therapy dogs for veterans. So you have inmates giving back by being able to train these dogs to hopefully help our heroes who served overseas and served in combat.
Well, and it's funny, you mentioned cooking. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I don't know how many viewers learned how to cook Italian food from watching the prison scene in The Goodfellas, right?
Well, listen, I'm from New Jersey, so presumptively my Italian cooking should be good. It's not. My cooking is so bad it would count as a parole violation in many states. But listen, they wouldn't even let me near the dining room in the prison when I was locked up. But the good news is that when this is not a soft on crime thing. Think of Texas. No one will ever accuse Governor Abbott in Texas of being soft on crime because they're not. They're one of the hardest on crime states in America. They have this place, you should Google Bartlett Innovation Unit. It's a 1,000-man facility, has many, many different types of job training programs. They have the inmate leave in a suit. Right, they're having employers come on to the Bartlett facility to pair with skilled folks before they get out. I mean, you're talking about a project that will not only restore the dignity of work for people, but contribute to the public safety of everyone. That's what's really important about this. And one other thing I'll say, look, when you're in prison, there are people there that you could serve a second chance to on a silver platter and they'd throw it in your face, right? But that's just human beings. 100% of us aren't going to participate in anything. But the overwhelming majority of people, if we show them a path to prosperity, they're going to take it.
You know, it's kind of interesting that you bring that up and talk about people viewing this as potentially soft on crime. And I can understand that, right? I mean, if I was the victim of the crime, or even looking at the victims of crime, even living in a community that's been victimized by crime, you think, okay, you know, some guy's out robbing people or stealing cars or whatever bad thing that they're doing, and they go in jail, and then what? They get, you know, 3 hots and a cot, and then they get hooked up with job training programs that you know, that I couldn't get during the Great Recession when I had just gotten out of high school and was looking at a job to help me pay my way through college. That was hardly available for me, and these guys get to be better off than when they went in. But then we have to think, well, what are we sending to people to jail for? I mean, the real name for jail, we call it penitentiary, which comes from the word penance, right? To actually make up for your crime, to do the work to become a better person. And to be honest, if we're sending people to jail, the only reason we should let them out is if we think they're going to be better people, if they're going to reintegrate into society. If they're not, why are we even going to let them out in the first place? So we should want these people to come out better, to be able to do better, to be a working part of our society. That should be the goal of sending someone in, unless we're literally sending them in and throwing away the key.
That's right. And, you know, look, remember, the deprivation of freedom is the punishment, right? And then what happens after the deprivation of freedom for that period of time affects us all. I had the pleasure on Friday of being at Main Justice, DOJ headquarters, for the event with almost exclusively law enforcement, where President Trump, Attorney General Bondi, and Kash Patel, our FBI director, all spoke. And this was geared towards combating the fentanyl epidemic. And as strong and as aggressive as we need to continue to be and will continue to be in this country on terrorists who traffic fentanyl and other illicit substances, this Department of Justice also agrees that we need halfway houses and things like that for our low-risk offenders, to make sure that they have the opportunities that they need, actually that we all need, for them to stop committing crime.
Well, and that's an extremely good point, because I live in Southern California, and we have an extreme homelessness problem here. Almost anywhere you go. San Diego is not the worst. They seem like they're trying to do a decent job. I came from Orange County. I used to work in Orange County politics around the time when we were dealing with the worst period of our homelessness crisis. I actually was part of setting up home. But actually, with county government, I went and spent the night in a homeless shelter just to see how it was operating and make sure they were doing a good job. So I've had a ground level look at these problems, and the reality is that there's a lot of people who, quite frankly, have the resources on the street and don't have the motivation, and they stay there and they want to stay there. And unless we're able to kind of, you know, get those people and scoop them up and say, no, you have to get in a work program, you have to find a job, you can't just be here. It's not just bad for us, right? It's not just bad for society because we have to deal with the increased crime and the health issues, but that's the real issue. Is it's not humane for them. It's not humane to let people with health issues and open sores and nasty infections and drug problems whittle their lives away in a gutter while we, you know, just try to inconvenience ourselves as little as possible. That's not right either. So looking at these programs, you know, actual work release programs that are designed to reduce recidivism, also reduce the negative lifestyle impacts on the people who are becoming the most burdensome to our communities.
That's exactly right. Burdensome, as you pointed out very correctly, to themselves. And thank you for taking the time to go and actually see what goes on inside a homeless shelter. A lot of folks would not. So that says a lot about you, man, because it's really important to get a bird's eye view of these sorts, or excuse me, an on-the-ground view of what goes on in these places. But the other piece is, remember, often co-presenting with homelessness are a series of mental health issues. And those mental health issues aren't always self-contained, right? They result, as we see in New York City, with people pushing others in front of subway trains and stabbing them on the streets and all these other things. So these investments are all investments in public safety. They're just different arrows in the quiver.
Oh, you're absolutely right. The unfortunate truth is that we need to actually make those investments. You know, Ronald Reagan, he did a lot of good things, but completely shutting down our mental health institutions, as corrupt as they were, as problematic as they were, without doing something with those people, that left us with a big problem that we're still dealing with today. Those people, you know, if you can't take care of yourself physically, you shouldn't be out on the street. You should be the ward of some sort of program that actually, that actually helps those people. And we see all these very high profile cases. I remember I worked with someone who was free Britney until she started dancing around with knives, and you realize, like, no, some people just by, whatever circumstances they're in, they need a little bit of extra help. That's just the reality. And sometimes we do need to be affirmative with what we do. I consider myself to be a pretty libertarian person with most things, but that we have to be compassionate when people are destroying themselves on the street. That's the bottom line.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head with Reagan, and that began way back under JFK, right? JFK's plan was to close the asylums and move them into and create more community based mental health care. And then they just didn't make any community-based mental health care, and then they closed the asylums, right? So, and then what happens is you ended up having nothing. And that was in the days when the DSM manual was, this big, right? Now the classification of things that are mental health disorders are gigantic, right? We have a mental health crisis in this country, and it bleeds into a crime crisis. And I think that then our county jails and our police who are trying to protect us become the de facto mental health hospitals. And no cop I know wants to be a social worker, right? They want to catch criminals. But instead, they're stuck dealing with emotionally disturbed people because those mental health resources are not there. And then for every time they're dealing with that person, they're not going after the gangbanger, the drug dealer, the rapist, the robber.
Well, in those situations too, it's kind of like a negative feedback loop because so many of those problems on the street are associated with drugs, right? We see crime, we see organized crime, street level crime really building into these systems of homelessness because these people, they use it to self-medicate, but it's ineffective. It actually exacerbates the problems. It makes them crazier, and then they go commit crimes because you have these gangs that are there to fence the stuff for them. So you have these guys fencing goods that are stolen right out of grocery stores, and they sell it on Amazon. They're using the money for drugs, and it's creating this extremely tight, very, very negative feedback loop. And you're right, when the police don't have the resources to actually take out the problem, to sort of uproot it, then they're really just kind of mowing over the lawn, mowing over the weeds over and over again until they grow up. And it's not a sustainable way to deal with the problem. I do want to talk to you a little bit, speaking of the drugs, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Trump administration's recent efforts to deport a lot of criminals who were caught here in the United States. They're very high profile. They've gotten pushed back in courts, but I think a lot of Americans are very pleased because this is what, frankly, a lot of people voted for Trump for explicitly this reason. We're going to have to take a super quick break, though. Folks at home, you're not going to want to miss this. We're back in 2. Welcome back to Nights with Chris Boyle. Back on the show is criminal law expert, prison reform activist John Koufos. John, before the break, we were talking all about how it's really worthwhile to work with people within our criminal justice system to try to get them reintegrated in society when they get out, get them things like jobs, make sure that they're not falling back into a life of crime. But unfortunately, as you and I were talking about, a lot of the crime in the United States is fueled, quite frankly, by drugs pumped in by transnational gangs. And a lot of these drugs, they fuel a problem that's kind of a negative feedback loop where you have people addicted to drugs, often with mental health issues, self-medicating with drugs that they're paying for by stealing out of our community and fencing that through the same gang. So, I mean, I guess smart of the gangs to work both angles. They're really keeping it. They have what do they call that? Vertical control of the supply chain, I guess. So, right. Kudos to them, but they need to be stopped. Quite frankly, I'm one of the people who's very stoked that we're getting these people out. El Salvador is taking them. We're paying them, according to Bukele, a little bit for us, a lot for them. Thank goodness for that exchange rate. And I have to assume that El Salvador's prisons are not nice places to be compared to our prisons. As bad as ours are, those have to be much, 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 much worse. So hopefully this is a deterrent. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think this is an effective move, or is this just showmanship?
No, I think that it's something that we really needed to consider. So back when I practiced law, I represented any number of organized crime sets and venues and things in different venues. And, the designation of the cartels as a foreign terrorist organization became the key that ironically unlocked the door to deportation. Because what happens is now these individuals can be declared or are declared as foreign terrorist organizations. So their deportation schedule is far different, right? It's right out under the under the immigration law. So that was the pathway, and I'm sure it was constructed that way. And I think the irony here is that the Trump administration has given people the opportunity to self-deport if they want to, and if they don't, they'll be they're identified as gang members and engage in criminal activity. They're out as long as they're here illegally. So this should disrupt certain gang activity on the street, right? Because if nothing else, you're taking people away who were committing crimes yesterday who aren't here to do so today. Sending them to El Salvador, I think, is a powerful message. I think there's 300 that were sent. I thought I read we're paying $6 million. So roughly, what's that? $55 per day per inmate, which is cheaper than many of the private halfway houses and private prisons in America. But more important than the cost is returning people to their point of origin, right, which is not here in America. And then also, I think, sending a very powerful message that if you are engaged in this sort of organized criminal activity, the standard operating procedure of perhaps getting arrested and perhaps being prosecuted and uncovered and put away here, that's no longer the game. You're going to go there, and then you're going to have to figure out what to do from that point. So I think it's a tremendously unorthodox tactic, but I think we're in an unorthodox situation. Again, as I mentioned before the break, being with the president and the attorney general and the FBI director at the Department of Justice on Friday, where they talked about all the efforts to combat fentanyl. I mean, these are some of the main people putting fentanyl out there. So, this will save lives, and it probably has already saved lives in a short amount of time since those flights have left.
It's funny, you say that this is kind of a novel thing, but I feel like Trump might have actually stolen this idea from some of these South American leaders, right? Because they say that that's what Cuba did, right? They emptied their crazy houses and prisons and sent them all to the United States. That's what they were saying Maduro did too, that he emptied the prisons and sent them all up through the Darien Pass and said, or through the Darien Gap and said, go up to the United States. They have, 3 hots and a cot up there. I wonder if he's just kind of playing a little bit of a Uno Reversi on him.
Yeah, I think there's some of that. And I think it's also that, ultimately you're talking about, a very, very professionalized group of people engaged in criminal activity, right? So the universe of what you can do to scare these people shrinks every minute, right? The only thing I will say is that, and we haven't heard anything about this, but, the measures to make sure that these individuals are being sent out of here who are here illegally are actually part of these gangs. I'm sure that's being handled with the utmost care and professionalism, because certainly we wouldn't want someone who is not a part of the gang to somehow be on the first plane to El Salvador when they could just be deported during the normal course. But other than that, I think that as we've seen gangs and these cartel-fueled gangs take over apartment buildings in Colorado, take over whole communities and city blocks, and really poison so many areas of the community. This is a non-traditional tactic to a non-traditional enemy in many ways.
So you mentioned that not a lot is going to scare these cartel guys, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen like the documentaries on, I think like A&E or whatever it is, the world's scariest prisons, and they always do Russia, and they always do, and then I think there's the other one too, like the world's nicest prisons, and it's always like, oh, Sweden, in Sweden it's a hotel room, and there's mandatory massages to make sure you don't shank anyone. It's really how they pat you down with a masseuse, and there's all these, it seems like there's a very clear delineation of prison ratings. How does El Salvador rank? In those videos that we saw that El Salvador released, the kind of hype videos where they had the guys doing the march, the duck march, and they had the music bumping, and we're all hyped up like, yeah, get them out of here. Is El Salvador sufficiently scary, or is this just another? Because you see like criminals in the United States, quite frankly, like the last time you were on, I showed you the video, the guy doing the music videos in prison. It seems like for many American criminals, going to prison is just like, honestly, almost like a rite of passage. It's just something that they end up doing, that they know they're going to do, that in a lot of ways they're resigned to. Do you feel like a prison in El Salvador is sufficiently scary to actually to work against these guys, or is this just going to be, jail is jail?
No, that's doing a different type of time, right? I mean, in El Salvador. So even those walks you talked about, I mean, they're barred right out of Russian prisons, right? I mean, if you ever watched the Russian prison system, that's normally how that works, right? You usually face down, you can't see where you're going, your head shaved, etc. It's a brand new facility. I think it's the largest outside of like a penal colony in North Korea or a penal colony in Siberia or Russia. It's the largest in at least this side of the world. It's brand new. They say it's escape proof, and it certainly looks that way. And I imagine they shoot you on sight if you try to escape. So I don't think you're going to get too many saying, "Hey, come on back," if you start to cross the gate or try to climb the fence. So it is a place that is. Remember, 40,000. 40,000 is a lot of 40,000 is more people, more residents than the city of Atlantic City, New Jersey, right? So just think of how many people there are in this single prison and think about the kind of strictures and control on it. This is the kind of place where we don't hear about escapes, and I don't think we don't hear about contraband. We don't hear about cell phones getting out. We don't hear about witnesses being killed from that location. So I have a feeling this is going to send a different type of message to these detainees.
No prison TikTok from there. I'm gonna have to be scrolling a long time before I see those
Probably
Instagram
not.
videos.
You're stuck with the American prisons for that.
That's okay. Like 40,000 people in Atlantic City? That's surprising me. There's cities in California with 40,000 illegal immigrants in them.
Yeah, under 40,000 Atlantic. I think it was like 38.
That's crazy.
So think about a prison, the whole with the same population as the whole place. I mean, it's that just gives you an idea of the scale and size. And just for comparison, if you see a prison with 1,000 beds, right, that's a pretty big place. If you see a prison with 3,000 beds in America, that's a big prison. 40,000 beds is big. Man, I was locked up in a place, I think 748 beds, I think it was 705, something like that, and that was known as one of the bigger spots in Jersey.
Well, they say, I don't know how true this is because I'm sure other countries lie about their numbers, quite frankly. But I always hear that United States has the highest incarcerated population in the world, and we have all these prisoners. So I don't know. I mean, from El Salvador, if you're just looking at making money from a resource standpoint, I mean, we, not to disparage fellow human beings, but we do actually like pay other countries to take our literal garbage. So I mean.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, I think that for people here illegally, I think the El Salvador solution is an option, right? I think for people here legally who commit crimes, they should be in American prisons. And I think the good news, like, for example, going back to sort of for the folks who are trying to rehabilitate themselves and who have an exit date, our Attorney General, Pam Bondi, even at her confirmation, one of the first things she said is she wants to see more halfway houses with job training programs for those people. But if we were to run out of immigration detention space, then yes, looking to other nations would be definitely a solve.
Well, and then this is another thing that almost seems to be one problem helping the other. I mean, when we're looking at a lot of these entry-level jobs that would be particularly suited for people who are just outside of prison, who have just been paroled, a lot of those, quite frankly, are jobs that are most heavily impacted by immigration issues. Now, naturally, we're just talking about cartel members. Hopefully, those aren't the jobs that our former prisoners are going to be taking. Hopefully, that's not the job market that opens up. But that said, immigration as a whole definitely contributes to those sorts of pressures. So, my hope is that this creates an overall environment where people are able to get out. There's less crime on the streets, which means there's less opportunity for them to fall back into criminal lifestyles. And at the same time, there's an increase of opportunities for them once they get out. I mean, again, California, I think I've said this before, but we have a ton of prisons here. We take prisoners from all across the country. So we're in a lot of ways a prison state. We have entire towns that basically the entire industry is prisoners. And we've had a lot of programs of varying success. We've had programs meant to tackle homelessness in Los Angeles and Orange County and here in San Diego that have been somewhat successful. Some have spent, gobs and gobs of money. At the same time, we've had programs that do see success. I do have to say, though, I worry about the connect between the skills that are learned through these programs and the skills that prisoners or former prisoners are able to use once they get out. Now, for instance, in California, we just had these very large fires, and one of the stories that I heard bandied about in left-wing media all the time is that there's firefighters that were on the ground that were incarcerated firefighters, but were unable to use those skills as firefighters once they got out, largely due to the fact that fire departments don't hire people with criminal records, which, quite frankly, I mean, they're given access to areas that, are often, have people evacuated out, often sensitive circumstances. I can understand that. I do have to say, what are your thoughts on the future when it comes to integrating some of these jobs that we teach prisoners with our rapidly changing economy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we see a lot of folks working to meet the moment. Again, down in Florida, the Secretary of Corrections, Ricky Dixon, has done a great job of putting coding and digital literacy programs through a group called Persevere in their prison. So certain offenders are learning coding and computer skills, right? That program, The Last Mile I mentioned, does that all over the country. Google Workspace is now being put in certain prisons, right? And Google has a whole suite of Grow with Google certifications. You could learn to be an AI engineer through the Grow with Google certifications. So we're starting to see more and more prisons index on that for precisely the reason you talked about. I mean, training someone for a job to nowhere doesn't benefit anybody, and it also reduces the amount of engagement in that job behind the wall. So, and to your point about the immigration, the labor shortage that could be caused by the new immigration policy. I published an op-ed way back in 2022 in Governing Magazine, said we don't have a labor shortage, we have a second chance shortage, because you could have nobody here illegally, and you would still have enough able-bodied adults willing to work with criminal records who could do so in appropriate jobs. I'm not suggesting that all these folks should run daycare centers or elder care environments, right? But for the type of jobs we're talking about, there are enough people with suitable criminal records, if properly trained and rehabilitated, to do them. And not for nothing, in the first term, the Trump economy required it. That's why second chance hiring, I think, was so hot during the first Trump administration, because the economy was hot. People needed workers, so they had to look to non-traditional ways, non-traditional places for non-traditional skilling as well.
Very well said. John, let's get to work. Dude, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, my friend.